Guadalcanal, 1943. Rain falls like artillery. Sheets of water hammer the coast, turning the red earth into a swamp of mud and misery. Palm trees bend under the wind's fury. Tents collapse into the muck. Amid the chaos, a curved silhouette rises from the storm. Steel ribs arched against the sky, corrugated panels glinting under flashes of lightning. Inside, a dozen Marines crouch beside their rifles, listening to the rain drum above their heads like a relentless march. The air is thick with sweat and damp, but the roof holds. Outside, a Japanese bomb explodes near the airstrip. Mud and shrapnel rain down. Yet the small building still stands. Its walls don't shatter. Its roof doesn't cave. When dawn comes, the men step outside into the steaming haze and look back at what saved them. A strange half-cylinder of metal. A Quonset hut. A structure born not from luxury, but from need. From the minds of engineers who had to make war itself livable. The question was simple. How do you build a home that can survive a world on fire? In 1941, as America prepared for a war it had not yet entered, a quiet problem loomed across military planning rooms. The U.S. Army and Navy were building bases faster than anyone could design them. Airstrips, depots, field hospitals, all expanding across oceans and continents. But every soldier needed shelter, and the tents they had were never meant for war. In the rain, they leaked. In the desert, they baked. And in the jungle, they rotted within weeks. Commanders called for a miracle. A building that could be shipped anywhere, built by anyone, and survive anything. The request landed at a small naval base on Rhode Island, Quonset Point Naval Air Station. Here, in the biting New England wind, a team of naval engineers and civilian architects from George A. Fuller Company gathered around a single drawing board. They weren't asked for comfort. They were asked for endurance. The Navy's brief was astonishingly simple and brutally demanding. A building light enough for a ship, strong enough for a storm, and cheap enough to build by the thousands. What they created would become one of the most iconic silhouettes of the Second World War. The idea wasn't entirely new. The engineers began by studying the British Naval hut, a semicircular steel shelter designed in World War I. It was efficient, curved ribs, corrugated iron, wooden lining, but the Americans wanted more. They needed something faster, more modular, and suited for the tropics. At Quonset Point, they reshaped the old British design into something unmistakably American. Feet wide, 36 feet long, made from corrugated galvanized steel. Wooden, end walls that could hold windows and doors. Bike, curved arch frame that gave it strength from every direction. And the most ingenious part, every piece could fit neatly into a standard shipping crate and be assembled anywhere in the world with nothing more than hand tools. Tests began that same winter. The prototype was built on the windy Rhode Island coast, a half-cylinder gleaming under gray skies. Engineers hosed it down, slammed its doors, shook its frame, and watched the rain roll off its curved back. It worked. A small, strange hut that defied both gravity and climate. Soon, the Navy gave the order. Mass production. Factories across the Northeast roared to life. Steel sheets were stamped, ribs curved, bolts packed. The first Quonset huts were loaded onto freighters bound for the Pacific. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked, the design was already being refined. Within months, the Navy ordered tens of thousands more. New variants appeared: barracks, hospitals, kitchens, chapels, workshops, command posts. The Seabees, the Naval Construction Battalions, learned to assemble them in hours. On distant islands, the huts rose like silver shells scattered across the jungle. Under relentless sun or tropical downpour, their curved roofs kept soldiers dry and cool. The name Quonset spread faster than the blueprints. Each hut carried a piece of American industrial power, a structure born from logic, but carrying something human at its core, the will to endure. And yet, few of those who lived inside them knew how this simple arch of steel came to be, or the extraordinary logistics that allowed it to appear anywhere, from the Aleutians to Guadalcanal. If stories like this move you, a quick click on the like and subscribe button tells us to make more of them. More moments where engineering met survival in the fire of war. The Quonset huts. Simplicity was its genius, but behind that simplicity lay one of the most efficient wartime production systems ever devised. By mid-1942, the United States was transforming into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Every factory, from Detroit to Providence, was retooled to feed the war machine. The Fuller Company and hundreds of subcontractors were soon producing hundreds of Quonset huts a day, their curved ribs stamped from cold steel in rhythmic precision. Each component was pre-cut, pre-drilled, and numbered. A puzzle that could be solved by anyone who could follow an instruction sheet. No cranes, no concrete mixers, just manpower, wrenches, and determination. Every crate contained the same magic formula. Lightweight corrugated steel panels for the shell. Prefabricated steel ribs that locked together in a perfect arch. Bolts, washers, wooden floors, and end panels marked in sequence. A team of 6 men could assemble one in a single day. From the Arctic to the equator, from desert sands to volcanic jungle mud, that one-day promise became reality. By late 1942, over 150,000 huts were in service. They became more than shelters. They were command posts, field hospitals, machine shops, and canteens. In some remote islands, Quonset huts even served as makeshift chapels where exhausted men found a quiet moment of peace. Each new theater of war demanded a different adaptation. The Quonset 40 variant stretched longer for barracks. The Quonset redesign model added improved ventilation and insulation. When the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the huts were shipped flat, then bolted together between bombing raids. When the Navy pushed north into Alaska, engineers reinforced the floors and lined the interiors with insulation, transforming them into Arctic domes. It wasn't just about surviving weather. It was about conquering logistics. Every Quonset hut could fit inside a standard shipping crate, loaded by crane into a Liberty ship's hold. Once the ship docked, Seabees rolled the crates onto trucks or amphibious craft. Within hours, an empty beach became a functioning base. The British and Canadians quickly took notice. Similar structures began appearing in North Africa and Burma, while the Soviets studied the design for use along the Eastern Front. The Quonset's arch became a global symbol of American practicality. Born of necessity, spread by war, but beyond blueprints and bolts, what truly made the Quonset hut remarkable was its democracy of purpose. It didn't care who lived inside, officer or private, medic or mechanic. Its curved steel protected all the same. On quiet nights in the South Pacific, soldiers could hear the tropical rain drumming on their roofs like a heartbeat, a sound that, for many, became the sound of survival. As the war expanded, so did the role of the Seabees, the naval builders whose motto was, "We build, we fight." They learned to unload steel under fire, level ground with bulldozers, and raise huts amid shell fire. At one base in the Solomons, they erected an entire hospital of Quonset huts within 3 days, saving hundreds of wounded men who would otherwise have perished in the rain. For every airfield that rose out of the jungle, for every island that became a fortress, the Quonset hut was there, humble, curved, Enduring, by 1943, more than 500,000 had been built. Their semicircular silhouettes marked every horizon, from Iceland's frozen wind to the mosquito-filled jungles of Papua New Guinea. The world had never seen such speed, such reach, or such unity of design, and yet, behind all that steel and precision, something deeply human endured. The understanding that survival in war often depended on the simplest things: a dry floor, a roof that held, a space to rest. In the silence after a bombing raid that mattered more than any weapon, at its heart, the Quonset Hut was a masterpiece of simplicity, an engineer's dream made real through wartime urgency. Its shape was no accident. The semi-cylindrical arch distributed stress evenly across its frame, meaning no single wall carried the full force of wind or blast. Where a square building might shatter under pressure, the Quonset simply flexed and held. Corrugated steel panels, light, ribbed, and interlocking, created a skin that was both strong and forgiving. It could dent without breaking, buckle without collapsing. When heat baked the surface, expansion rippled smoothly along the curve. When storms hit, rain slid harmlessly down its sides. Every feature had purpose. No ornament, no waste. Even its size, 16 by 36 feet in the early models, reflected precise naval calculations. Big enough for a small crew, small enough to ship by the thousands. Inside, wooden floors insulated the men from the soaked ground below, while adjustable louvers allowed air to flow through the arch, turning suffocating heat into bearable warmth. In the jungle, where mildew claimed everything, Quonset floors stayed dry for months. It was an engineer's poem, lines of function written in steel and wood. And yet, its real power came not from design alone, but from how easily that design could move through a world at war. To the soldiers who lived inside, the Quonset Hut was more than a shelter. It was a fragile slice of normal life carved out of chaos. After weeks of sleeping under tarps or in flooded tents, stepping into a dry hut felt almost luxurious. Men hung photos of home on the curved walls. They built shelves from ammunition crates, strung makeshift lights from the arches, even carved names into the wooden end panels. At night, the sound of rain on the steel roof became strangely comforting, a rhythm that separated them from the world outside. The hut's shape amplified every sound: the thud of boots, the low hum of a generator, the laughter that echoed like it belonged in a much larger room. Still, the Quonset Hut wasn't without hardship. In the tropics, heat turned it into an oven by day. At dusk, insects invaded every corner. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and rust. But it was theirs, and it survived. When typhoons swept through the Solomons or bombs fell near airfields in the Marianas, the men learned to trust that curved roof more than anything else. Letters written from those huts often described them as ugly but invincible. In a war where every comfort was temporary, the Quonset Hut became a quiet promise that for one night, at least, the roof would hold. The Quonset Hut didn't just protect lives, it made logistics possible. In the Pacific Theater, where every island demanded its own infrastructure, time was as valuable as ammunition. Traditional buildings took weeks. Quonset huts took hours. Each hut was a self-contained system: panels, bolts, floors, and blueprints. A single cargo ship could carry thousands of huts packed flat, ready for instant assembly. Once on shore, Seabees and Marines followed numbered diagrams like a massive 3D puzzle, laying the wooden floor, raising steel ribs, then bolting on the corrugated shell. In the mud of Bougainville or the coral dust of Tarawa, men worked by flashlight, racing storms and enemy aircraft. And when they were done, they stood back to see not just a building, but a symbol, proof that order could rise out of ruin. This speed of construction transformed how the U.S. military fought. Airfields, hospitals, mess halls, command centers, all appeared seemingly overnight. War was no longer fought from tents. It was fought from steel. Even General Douglas. MacArthur's forward headquarters in the Pacific featured rows of Quonset huts linked by wooden walkways, a miniature city of curved roofs in the middle of chaos. Each hut was an identical unit of order, repeatable, replaceable, efficient. It was the architecture of logistics itself. Through its curves and bolts, the Quonset hut represented the soul of wartime engineering, the merging of necessity and ingenuity. But its story doesn't end with how it was built or used. It also carried deeper meanings, how enemies perceived it, and how it lived on long after the guns fell silent. To the Japanese and German forces, the Quonset hut became an unsettling symbol of American persistence. On islands that had been bombed for weeks, reconnaissance photos would show a strange pattern emerging. Half-cylinder roofs glinting under the sun, where jungles once stood. American bases, they realized, didn't stay destroyed for long. When airfields were cratered by Japanese bombers, Seabees returned within hours. Within days, new Quonset huts rose from the debris. From a distance, they looked like rows of silver shells. Alien, efficient, impossible to count. In the Pacific, Japanese intelligence officers reported that American engineers seemed to build overnight what takes others months. On the European front, German POWs sent to Allied camps often lived in the same curved huts that had housed the men who captured them. It was a quiet irony of war. The same design protecting both sides, proof that practicality had no allegiance. The Quonset hut showed enemies that American industry wasn't just about firepower. It was about permanence. Bombs could fall, storms could strike, but the curved roofs would return, identical and endless. The Quonset hut didn't just survive the war, it became a cultural icon of it. For the men who served, those huts carried the smell of fuel, sweat, and salt air. They were the backdrop of every letter home, every photograph taken at a faraway base. When veterans returned, they remembered the shape instantly. That familiar curve rising over jungles and beaches, a symbol of discipline and survival. But to civilians, the Quonset hut represented something else entirely: adaptability. After the war ended, millions of surplus huts were sold for next to nothing. Across America and Europe, they became homes, workshops, schools, and churches. Students studied under their arches. Farmers stored grain inside them. Artists turned them into studios. For a generation rebuilding from rubble, the Quonset hut was hope made tangible. The architecture of survival repurposed for peace. In Britain, similar Nissen and Romney huts were used to house war brides and refugees. In Japan, U.S. occupation forces lived in Quonset-style barracks that dotted the ruins of cities. Even in post-war Germany, they appeared across reconstruction zones, relics of a world that refused to stay broken. The curved roof became a global silhouette. Practical, familiar, almost comforting. What began as a wartime emergency had quietly reshaped how the world thought about shelter. 80 years later, the Quonset hut still stands, rusted, patched, but enduring. From old airfields in the Pacific to forgotten depots in Iceland, many remain exactly as they were built in 1943. Engineers still study their design for lessons in modular construction and disaster housing. Modern prefabricated homes, emergency shelters, and field hospitals all trace their lineage to that Rhode Island blueprint. Even NASA's lunar habitat concepts borrow the same principle: curved, modular, transportable, resilient architects call it utilitarian beauty. The Quonset hut didn't pretend to inspire awe, it simply worked. Its cultural afterlife is astonishing. College campuses used them as temporary classrooms through the 1950s. Small towns turned them into grocery stores and garages. Artists converted them into galleries, drawn to the poetic symmetry of the arch. In the Pacific, local villagers repurposed abandoned huts into homes, churches, and meeting halls, living within the very walls once meant for war. Through all this, the Quonset hut became more than a military artifact. It became a metaphor for endurance, for how something built in haste could last for generations. The Quonset hut's story, however, wasn't just about design or survival. It became a quiet turning point, an invisible factor in how America projected its power across oceans, and how men endured the unendurable. To see its true significance, we must step into the heat and rain of the Pacific, where the Quonset hut proved not just useful, but essential. Guadalcanal, late 1942. The jungle roared with life. Insects, thunder, gunfire, rain. The first U.S. foothold in the Pacific was a nightmare of mud and fever. Tents sank into the ground. Supplies spoiled within days. Men slept soaked, woke coughing, and went to work rebuilding what the weather destroyed each night. When the Marines and Seabees landed, they were told to make an airfield. What they found instead was chaos, a swamp crawling with mosquitoes, ringed by Japanese artillery. And yet, within weeks, the strange curved shapes began to rise among the palm trees. The first Quonset huts had arrived. Each hut came in a crate barely larger than a jeep. Inside, ribs, panels, bolts, and a simple manual. The Seabees unloaded them between bombing raids, laying wooden floors on the soaked earth, bolting arches by lantern light. By the time the next storm hit, the first huts were finished. When the typhoon swept through Guadalcanal, everything else fell. Tents tore like paper. Wooden shacks collapsed. But the Quonset huts bent and held. Inside, wounded men lay on stretchers under dim bulbs powered by a sputtering generator. The wind howled outside, the walls groaning but refusing to yield. It wasn't luxury, it was survival. In the weeks that followed, the huts multiplied. One became 5, then 50. A forward hospital, a repair shop, a briefing room. They spread like the veins of a living organism. Efficient, silent, and vital. To the men who fought on Guadalcanal, those curved roofs came to mean something almost sacred. Safety. When Japanese bombers hit Henderson Field, men dove not into foxholes, but into the Quonsets. And when they emerged, brushing dust from their uniforms, the huts were still standing, dented, scorched, but intact. In war diaries, Marines called them lifesavers made of steel. For the Seabees, they became a badge of pride, proof that construction was as heroic as combat. As the campaign dragged on, engineers adapted. Huts were linked end to create workshops longer than aircraft wings. Some were raised on stilts above floodplains, others buried halfway into hills for added protection. Wherever the front line moved, the huts followed, a portable heartbeat of American presence. Even generals took notice. By 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz personally inspected Quonset installations in the South Pacific and ordered them prioritized for all forward bases. For him, they weren't just shelters, they were infrastructure in a box, the difference between chaos and command. And indeed, command began to flow from within those arches. Air operations, intelligence briefings, communications centers, all ran from Quonset huts. The curved walls echoed with the sounds of typewriters, field radios, and the constant drone of strategy meetings that shaped the Pacific Campaign. Every successful island assault, from Tarawa to Saipan, began in a hut like those. Each was a small command post, an island within an island. By the end of 1943, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had built more than 50,000 huts across the Pacific. They stood in lines along airstrips, curved shadows under blinding sun, humming with the sound of machines and men. They weren't glamorous, but they worked. And in that brutal environment, working was everything. The Quonset Hut was proving something profound, that, in a war of destruction, survival came not only from weapons, but from design. By 1944, the Quonset Hut had become the backbone of American infrastructure in the Pacific. From the jungles of New Guinea to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, the curved silhouette was everywhere, a quiet army of steel and bolts supporting the one that carried rifles. Each new campaign tested the design in ways its creators could barely have imagined. At Bougainville, torrential rains turned airfields into lakes within hours. Yet rows of Quonset huts stood untouched, their arched shells deflecting the downpour. At Tarawa, huts rose on coral foundations, the only structures to remain intact after the battle. At Tinian, where the vast B-29 airfields were carved out of limestone, the huts became control towers, intelligence rooms, and living quarters for the crews who would soon carry the war to Japan itself. By the time the Seabees landed on Saipan in mid-1944, Quonset huts were arriving by the thousands. Within weeks, the bare island had transformed into a functioning city. Airstrips, mess halls, power plants, hospitals, all born from those same curved ribs and bolts. The huts turned barren islands into operational bases faster than anyone thought possible. That speed changed everything. It meant bombers could fly sooner. The wounded could be treated immediately. Commanders could plan under shelter instead of in the open. The Quonset Hut had become more than an engineering success. It was a strategic multiplier. It gave American forces endurance. On Guam, Seabees worked 18-hour days, assembling hundreds of huts in blistering heat. Their hands bled, their uniforms stiff with salt and sweat, yet they kept building. Each hut raised was another step toward stability, another foothold in the Pacific. Build it, then move on, they said, and they did, leaving behind an entire functioning base where only jungle had stood a month before. When the U.S. captured Tinian and Saipan, the huts lined the perimeter of the B-29 airfields. Crews of the Enola Gay and Boxcar, the bombers that would eventually end the war, lived and worked inside them. Those huts, simple and curved, stood at the center of history's most consequential moment. It's here that the Quonset Hut transcended its function. It became a stage for the decisions that defined the war's closing act. From their steel, interiors came not only the whir of generators, but the whispered discussions of missions that would end an empire. And through it all, the huts kept standing, battered by wind, strafed by fragments, soaked in the humid air, yet unbroken on Iwo Jima, where volcanic ash tore at boots and lungs alike. Seabees raised Quonsets within days of the beachhead being secured. They served as emergency hospitals, curved cocoons of steel sheltering hundreds of wounded Marines under flickering lamps. Doctors operated through the night while artillery echoed outside. The huts shook with every blast, but their arches held. Reports from the field told of one hut that survived a direct hit from a near-miss bomb. The blast flattened tents nearby, but the hut's frame merely twisted and settled back into place. For the men inside, it was nothing short of miraculous. By the final year of the war, nearly 170,000 Quonset huts had been built, more than any other single wartime structure in history. They dotted the Pacific like a constellation of curved stars, each one a node of endurance. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, many huts were still under construction. In the ruins of Okinawa and Manila, they became housing for civilians, hospitals for the wounded, and command posts for reconstruction. They had survived bombs, storms, and jungle heat, just as the engineers at Quonset Point had promised. And now, as peace dawned, they would face a new test: survival in a world without war. When peace finally came in 1945, the Quonset Hut had already become one of the most recognizable shapes on Earth. More than 170,000 had been built during the war, from the coral atolls of the Pacific to the tundra of Alaska, from English airfields to Persian depots. But now, as soldiers returned home and the world tried to breathe again, the question arose: what do you do with 1,000,000 tons of war-built steel, designed for battlefields that no longer existed? The answer was as practical as the hut itself. You reuse it. Across the United States, surplus Quonset huts were sold to civilians for as little as $1,000 each. They arrived on flatbed trucks, uncrated and ready to build again. This time not for soldiers, but for families, students and farmers. College campuses, flooded with returning veterans under the GI Bill, faced a housing crisis. The solution came straight from the Pacific. Rows of Quonset huts repurposed into dormitories and classrooms. At universities from Minnesota to California, students studied under those same curved roofs that had once echoed with gunfire and rain. Farmers turned them into barns and workshops. Small towns used them for grocery stores, bus depots, and even roller rinks. Architects, fascinated by their clean lines and structural economy, experimented with new designs, giving birth to early ideas of modular and prefabricated housing. In post-war Europe and Asia, the huts played a different role. They became shelters for refugees and displaced families, a place to start again amid the ruins. In bombed-out cities from Hamburg to Manila, curved steel huts stood between destruction and recovery. The U.S. Army donated thousands for humanitarian use. In Italy and Greece, the huts became schools. In Korea and Japan, they housed orphanages and aid stations. What had once been a tool of war now carried the burden of peace. To those who had lived through the war, the sight of a Quonset hut meant stability. To a generation growing up after it, it meant rebuilding. Newspapers in 1946 called them the building that refuses to die. And they were right. Quonset huts proved nearly indestructible in peacetime, too. Decades later, their curved silhouettes could still be found in unexpected places, beside highways, near airports, on farms and campuses. Some were rusted relics. Others, freshly painted, still served their purpose. The structure's life was far from over. In fact, it was just evolving, because as nations rebuilt, a new question emerged. Could wartime design teach peace how to endure? In the years that followed, the Quonset hut quietly became part of civilian life, a ghost of war reshaped for peace. By the early 1950s, whole communities across America were still living, studying, and working inside them. On the West Coast, veterans raised families beneath the same steel arches that once sheltered them on island outposts. Children played where once soldiers had waited out monsoon rains. At the University of California, Davis, rows of Quonset huts served as lecture halls and labs. In Alaska, they stored food and fuel for entire towns. In the Midwest, they became grain silos and garages. The design that conquered jungle heat now braved snow and ice. Architects and engineers studied the hut's perfect efficiency. Some called it the purest expression of wartime necessity. Others saw in it the blueprint for a new era, one where architecture was modular, mobile, and democratic. Even modern disaster relief shelters and mobile field hospitals trace their ancestry to the Quonset's genius: curved geometry that gives maximum strength with minimal material. But while the huts lived on, their story was fading from public memory. For many, they were simply part of the landscape: practical, unassuming, unglamorous. And yet, their endurance spoke volumes. On former battlefields across the Pacific, Quonset huts still stand today, rusted, patched, half swallowed by vines. Locals use them as workshops, warehouses, or chapels. They lean slightly now, their steel dulled by decades of rain. But they remain upright, silent memorials to a time when survival depended on ingenuity. Engineers who visit those sites often remark on their condition. No foundations, no modern reinforcements, just thin steel, careful design, and a shape that defies decay. In Rhode Island, at the original Quonset Point Naval Air Station, a few of the first huts are preserved. Their panels bear the scars of testing and time, but they still stand as they did in 1941. Proof that good design doesn't just endure war, it outlives it. Even today, architects borrow from the Quonset's DNA. Prefabricated housing, rapid deployment bases, even Mars habitat prototypes use the same arch-based physics. 80 years later, the hut's lessons remain: simplicity, modularity, and strength through curvature. But beyond the metal and bolts lies something deeper, a reminder of the men who built them and those who slept beneath them. They were born of fear, built for survival, and remembered for endurance, a product of the darkest years of the 20th century. Yet a testament to what human beings can create when survival demands brilliance. In every war, there are inventions built to destroy, and others built to endure. The Quonset hut was one of the latter. It never fired a shot. It never flew or sank or roared. But wherever the war went, it followed, bending, never breaking. From the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of the Solomons, its curved shadow sheltered the same truth. Survival isn't just about strength. It's about design, cooperation, and the quiet genius of human hands. It was never meant to last this long, and yet, 80 years later, its ribs still stand against wind and salt, rusted but alive, echoes of the men who built them with wrenches and willpower. Each Quonset hut still standing is a time capsule, a steel memory of the war's industrial poetry, a reminder that even in the darkest years, humanity found ways to build, to protect, to endure. When engineers at Quonset Point first drew that perfect curve in 1941, they didn't just design a hut. They designed a principle: that simplicity, when guided by purpose, can outlast the chaos that created it. The war ended long ago, but somewhere, under a curved roof humming in the wind, a piece of that purpose remains. Steel bends. People rebuild, and memory, like the Quonset hut, endures. Steel bends, but memory endures. Subscribe to WW Tales Stories and join us as we uncover more of the designs, decisions, and human moments that shaped the Second World War. Which part of this story struck you most? The ingenuity, the endurance, or the quiet humanity behind it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them.